Welcome to everyone. It's good to see you. It's especially good to see you, given that Ukraine is so often in my thoughts and my prayers over these last months. I would like to start with just a couple of lines from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, two verses that are not often read, at least I don't hear them, read often and even less preached on, which I will not do. I will not preach in our session. I'll try to make it as practical as possible. But I thought it would be a good way for us to start. So Matthew chapter 13, verses 51 and 52. Jesus asks them, "Have you understood all this?" And they answer, "Yes." And he says to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." I wonder if they really were very confident in answering the question, have they understood what Jesus was speaking? Anyway, they said yes. But Jesus's image of scribe as a master of a household, bringing out treasures new and old, is in many ways what our session is about. Our task of working with treasures, old and new, things uncovered by ourselves as we dig into insights and gifts discovered by others. So I invite you to take this image with you as you go through our seminar today. See if you find it helpful. Just a few words about myself, which I think will help you to also understand where we're going. Ksenia already has given some of my titles. I come from Scotland now, but I grew up not so far from Ukraine. I grew up in Lithuania, so mainly not too far from you. And at the time when it was still annexed by the Soviet Union. It was in a pastor's family. And one of my earliest memories is the excitement that would be there when there would be a new book that one way or another had become available. Often just for a limited time, because you soon need to pass it to the next person, because these are rare things. Christian literature was really difficult to get. Often these were samizdat books. My family were often busy translating books and putting the translation on the typewriter. When you get a valuable resource in such a context, your task as a follower of Jesus was actually to copy as much of it as possible. In fact, what would have been sinful in that context, in that situation, what would have been selfish is not to copy and not to make it available, not to spread it as widely as you can. That's what was the right thing for that time in those circumstances. And when the Soviet regime failed and the culture around me changed dramatically, some of you also probably have similar memories, then you might also share with me the experience of this strange turn to things like copyright and plagiarism, and having to really kind of begin to understand how that whole thing works. But what I carry with me is the reminder that contexts and cultures will always play a huge role in determining what is right in our relation to reading ideas of others. And that is also true in relation to any concerns relating to plagiarism. Well, we now live in a different world where plagiarism in academic setting is a serious issue. I sometimes find myself needing to hold the hand of a student who has panicked and just copied and pasted material from somewhere from their assignment, for their assignment from somebody else. Or at times, again, I need to explain what exactly plagiarism is to someone who comes from a non-Western culture and is totally baffled, totally perplexed why what they were doing is considered plagiarism. So we will talk about how to avoid unintentional plagiarism later. What I am concerned about, and the concern that I want to share with you as I start, is the fact that plagiarism is very much alive and well in academic writing, including theology. From time to time, we hear scandals, when some plagiarism case is uncovered, and then, the person goes away in shame, and maybe her or his book is recalled, and, all the rest. I also am thinking of some conferences or gatherings where I could see that the person is very much on guard as they speak and share their ideas, because they know it hasn't been published yet. And they're afraid that somebody else will take those ideas and publish them first as their own. Even more worryingly, I know that you can develop skills in not getting caught. If you're really smart, you can find a way to package ideas that you take from others in such a way that it's just too vague for somebody to say, clearly you took it from, that source. And I'm sharing this with all of you because I want to invite you to think about deeper issues, which include plagiarism, but actually are larger than that. I want to invite you to think, first of all, about the virtues that we need as researchers, as theological educators, as theological authors. It's partly my background. I have worked in the field of ethics. So some of you might know that virtue ethics is an interesting and lively field, having echoes of Aristotle, yes, going all the way there to ancient Greece, but especially perhaps the work of Alistair MacIntyre, a Scottish American thinker who has really put it on the map. And if you're struggling with the word virtues, then you can also think about them as skills or qualities that you would like to possess. In fact, those qualities can be improved. They're a bit like training muscles. So in some ways, we can think about sports exercises in the same way as we can think about virtues and developing them. As we strive to be good writers, good thinkers, good theologians. So that's why, first of all, I would like just for a minute or two to think with you about not so much, first of all, what we should do or not do, how to avoid plagiarism, how not to plagiarize, what we should be, the virtues that we need to have in order to write faithfully, in order to work as followers of Jesus, in order to have the integrity with which we hope people will associate the good news of Jesus. And in order to think about them in the context of theological writing and academic publishing, I imagine, or I would like to invite you also to imagine your academic writing as a conversation, perhaps almost like you being the host of a radio show. It's a radio show in which you decide usually who to invite to that conversation, depending on the topic. You also contribute quite a bit to that conversation. But you want to make sure that you invite the right people, and therefore there's a limit, right? You can't invite 100. You can't have a conversation with 100 people. It's a limited number of people. You want to make sure that each one of these guests that you have invited to your theological radio show, metaphorical show, you want to make sure that each one of them is heard in their own terms, that they're heard well, that they're not misrepresented, they have a chance to explain the position with which they come. You also determine the order in which you want to speak. You want them to speak, and when you want them to come back and tease a little bit more, and when you want to put 2 or 3 of them kind of to bash something out, to have a little bit of an argument. That's your responsibility. And And it's your responsibility because you know the direction to which you're going, even as you keep it open enough, because you don't quite know where the conversation will end until you finish hosting your show, until you finish your theological article, your academic piece of work. In all of this conversation, it should also be quite clear where it is your own voice, your own thoughts, and where you're enabling us to hear the ideas of your guests, so to speak. So that's the image I would like to offer you. And in order to do this conversation well, if you imagine yourself to be this kind of a radio show host, I would suggest a few virtues, a few qualities for us all to consider. It's not a full list. In fact, in a moment or two, I'll ask you if you would like to put in the chat, if it's enabled, if that's okay, to put a virtue perhaps that is important to you, something that perhaps you've discovered as really significant in your own development as an academic thinker, as a writer. But here are my starting virtues. First one of them perhaps is courage. And for us, coming from Eastern context especially, I think it comes with even greater difficulty. The trust that I have enough to say, and the temptation to kind of hide behind other voices, other sources, more authoritative sources, and kind of disappear behind it, so that all that you're doing, you're kind of reporting the thoughts of others. So that's something definitely that needs to be developed. It doesn't come overnight usually for most of us. You don't wake up one day and decide you have grand ideas. In fact, I would be a bit worried if that's what happens to you. But little by little, hopefully you realize that your perspective is unique. And as long as it's supported by some other virtues that we can talk about, it is a gift. It is a gift to others. It is a gift to the world. It is a gift to the church. So use it. Ask questions, again, like that host of this metaphorical theological radio show. Consider different possibilities, even if it turns out that you might be wrong, which it will from time to time. That's why it's courage. There's no guarantees. You take a bit of a risk, but it's so worth taking. In fact, unless you do it, the whole exercise, I would say, loses much of its meaning, at least the way we do it in today's world. So courage in what you might be able to contribute, and making sure that your own voice is clear and visible. At the same time, because it will turn out that sometimes you might be wrong, you might have misunderstood something, you might need to reconsider some things, you need the virtue of humility. So that's the second one I would add. There is so much that you don't know. None of us know everything. And that's one of the reasons why we need others. We need their ideas. We need these different books and articles and conference talks and so on. And as we listen, actively listen and graciously listen, although that probably returns us to another virtue, but that humility, that humble posture going with courage is a really, really good combination to write something that will be meaningful and deep. So courage and humility. And I have one more probably that I want to touch on today, and that is generosity. Acknowledging those others, acknowledging your guests in your metaphorical radio show, acknowledging the books and speakers and friendly suggestions that were given to you, and also being interested how in your conversation could be developed further in their company. Again, I think sometimes out of fear, people feel like the more they acknowledged how much they depend on others' work, the less their own value, which of course is the other way around, I would want to argue. But that kind of general posture of always being grateful for what others had to say, whether directly to you in response to what you said, or whether you've just encountered them as you read or listened to something, the generosity of acknowledging them. And that, as we will see, of course, goes right to the center of plagiarism as an issue. So these are my three virtues. That probably will be enough. We could continue the list with many others, but we don't have time for that today. Courage in speaking and offering some ideas that will be original. Humility, which leads you to listening and engaging with the thoughts and ideas of others. And generosity in always acknowledging where these ideas that you found meaningful and helpful come from. That's my list, and I will keep talking, but if in the chat, is it okay to use the chat, Ksenia?
Yes.
Great. If you would like, and you will see how much Ukrainian I understand or not, but feel free just to put down if you have a particular virtue, particular quality for a theological researcher and writer that you would like to add, then feel free. So that's what we will do. By the way, notice how these virtues are real life virtues, so to speak. It's something that we are very much encouraged to be as followers of Jesus. And again, that to me is really important. Sometimes in the academic world, especially if you're doing it in secular context, so you're a theologian, but perhaps working in a secular university, it can be especially difficult. The atmosphere can be really aggressive, really unfriendly. And I would just encourage you to come back to these virtues, because this is what is life-giving. This is what will sustain you in your own work of theological writing. So yes, as time is going and I want you to be able to ask questions, let's then look at the issue of plagiarism itself. Well, you probably know the definition, but just in case, here's one version. Plagiarism is using someone else's work or ideas without giving them proper credit, proper acknowledgement. It's using words, ideas, or information from a source without acknowledging it. In its most blatant form, it means lifting the words produced by someone else and presenting them as if they are your own. So there's no footnote, no reference. You cut and paste if you're doing it on the computer. And of course, you do it without quotation marks. And I think we kind of understand that, even those of us who grew up with, that being the norm, and at the end you would just say literature used, we kind of probably know that this is not acceptable, just taking the words verbatim, word by word, word for word, and then presenting them as if they are your own. But what surprises some people at times is that there are several other versions of plagiarism, because plagiarism is also, in that definition and in practice, copying someone else's text and then providing a reference, following it with a footnote. So you lift it word by word, and yes, you provided the footnote, you showed the source, or if you're using in-text quotation, then you have it in your brackets, the name of the author, the year it was published. What happens is that you've acknowledged that you've borrowed the idea, but you failed to acknowledge the fact that you've stolen the actual words. Okay. So plagiarism is not just about, sort of stealing and not even saying anything. It's in terms of idea. It's also treating with respect the way the author has written those ideas. So if you really, really want to use the actual words that the author used, then you have to put them in quotation marks. So this is another way plagiarism happens, where the footnote says, yes, this is the source, but because there are no quotation marks, it looks like you've paraphrased it. You put it in your own words. It's just the idea that you're referring to. We can perhaps talk about it a little more in our Q&A time, question and answer time. So that's another way plagiarism happens. Also, another way to commit plagiarism is if you liked somebody's idea, you liked what they say, you do put it in your own words. So you're not stealing their words, but you take their idea, you rehashed it, and then you present it as your own. You don't acknowledge the source. This is what I was talking about earlier. If you're really smart, you can do that. And it's very hard to prove that you've done it. But then talking to you as people of faith, I think that's what I would want to appeal back to the virtues that we are invited to keep developing. So, different forms of plagiarism. When you copy somebody else's text and don't mention the text at all. When you copy somebody else's language and provide a reference to the author, but you don't put the actual words that they use, then you have reused in quotation marks. That's also plagiarism. Or when you steal somebody else's idea, you completely rework it, you put in your words, but you don't say that you actually got this idea from that article, from that book, from that source. These are the three I mostly see. We could talk later a little bit about self-plagiarism, but I think that's further down the line. What is important also to know is that plagiarism applies both to published or unpublished material, printed or electronic forms. And remember, I shared with you my experience that sometimes even theologians presenting at a conference would be quite guarded because they're afraid that somebody will use those ideas and kind of steal them, which is really sad to think about. That's also plagiarism. And it doesn't matter that it wasn't published, but if somebody talked about it and you found it helpful and you want to use it, you want to acknowledge it. Okay. Plagiarism is really a breach of integrity. That's another way sometimes it's presented, which is why, again, back to this attitude of generosity, acknowledge your sources for inspiration, even when they're relatively minor. Of course, it's possible to go overboard if you're very concerned, you don't want every sentence to be followed with a reference, but I hardly ever see that being a problem. So give credit. That would be my invitation. Give credit also to your colleagues when they offer you good suggestions, good questions. I'm always warmed by footnotes which acknowledge somebody else's contribution, in a seminar, or I thank so-and-so for pointing to me out the importance of blah, 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 whatever. Sometimes they even say, it happened in the class, in January 2015. And unfortunately, I do not remember who exactly said that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this is where it happened. And again, I think, yeah, that's the way to do it. So even when you don't remember who gave you the idea, do your best, just give them credit. So in order to avoid this, the skills that we're talking about is really knowing when to quote directly and when to paraphrase or summarize. Paraphrasing and summarizing others' ideas, that's kind of the same thing. It's just obviously summary is much shorter. Paraphrasing is longer, more detailed. But basically, you're reworking everything. You're really reworking even the language flow. Being able to convey somebody else's ideas in your own words is hugely important. First of all, you will often realize when you try that maybe you haven't fully understood even what they said. At least I find that to be the case, which again becomes an important reason to go back to the book or the article and say, okay, so what did they say? how can I put it in my own words? So I would suggest that when you're trying to paraphrase or summarize somebody else's idea, you put the book aside or minimize the window if you're reading online, and then try to say, right, what was the meaning of this? And as I say, try to also change the language, the grammar, completely. It's not just about replacing words with their synonyms. It's finding your own way to express what the author was saying, whilst retaining the meaning that they meant. It gets much better with practice, and those of you who have had practice probably will agree with me. It can be daunting first, but it's very, very doable. So you do that, you put it in your own words, you follow it with a footnote or whatever style you're using, with a reference, and you give credit to the idea, to the page where it was found. But you don't use quotation marks because obviously you used your own language to do it. Now, sometimes you might want to actually capture the author's language, in which case you will use the quotations, but don't overuse it. It really shouldn't be almost, well, it depends what you're doing, obviously. But yeah, try to keep it maybe to 5% of the whole piece in direct quotations. As I say, it will depend on the nature of your work, but mostly paraphrase, summarize, and when needed, absolutely needed, then quote. So we can talk about the mechanics, of course, and maybe we can pick it up in the question time. I am a huge fan of footnotes. Now, it's not always possible because some formats of referencing use in-text referencing, so parentheses, and it's fine. I missed the opportunity to say maybe a little bit more, which you can in a footnote, but you can do it either way. Whichever it is, footnotes or in-text references, think of them as a map you're providing to your reader, because they can go then to those sources and discover a little bit more and maybe get into conversation with the original author and with you and write their own piece. That's how we can do it. Whenever possible, give the exact page numbers. I can't tell you how annoying it is when you're trying to trace that idea in the original source that the author referenced, and you can't see it because they were sloppy in putting the actual page number. So do that again. You're doing it for the sake of your reader, so that they can find it. They can walk the same journey as you have walked. Okay, we're nearly at the end. So just a few words on avoiding accidental plagiarism. Because those of you who are anxious to do everything right, perhaps are wondering, what if I'm doing plagiarism all the time without knowing it, or whatever? In which case, first of all, I want to calm you. I want to say people who worry about not plagiarizing usually don't. It's those that don't care about the issue that end up plagiarizing. But what happens sometimes is that we are busy working and we forget to note the source. We think, I'll do it later. And then it just slips our memory. And accidentally, really completely unintentionally, it ends up looking more like our own idea. Then, in English, there's a very strange, so for those of you who might be doing it in English, I don't know how it works in journals like Theological Reflection or generally in Ukrainian academia, whether you use block quotations. The quirk about it is not that it looks different. The quirk is, in English standards at least, you don't use quotation marks, which, if you ask me, is crazy, because it takes one click on computer as you're reformatting for the thing to start looking like the rest of your text, completely accidental. So this is what I mean about accidental plagiarism. That is the one, friends, that you want to keep an eye. So what I do, I always put quotation marks. even if it's a very long quotation, I know I'll need to later, using Chicago style, remove those quotes and quotation marks and so on, because I just don't want to end up with that. I've seen bad things happening. In fact, it was a dissertation, and the student, this is what happened to them. I do tend to believe this is what happened. Unfortunately, their examiner happened to be the author of the offending block quotation, and it looked like it's, like they stole the words. They acknowledged the idea, but they stole the actual words. So disciplinary procedure and all the rest of it. So always put any direct language in quotation marks.